right, thanks very much, Helen, and everyone else has been speaking today. It's been a very interesting session. Hopefully everyone can see my screen. So firstly, just acknowledge my co-authors there. I'm really just the messenger. We've got a couple of great postdocs, Jonathan Clout here and Jess Stedman, who are doing the heavy lifting, along with Max Hole, who's a new PhD student who's working on STARA. So a real team effort both down at Codes and also with the broader research collaboration between GSQ and CSIRO and ourselves. So thanks to GSQ for both supporting the research financially, but in particular the amount of sampling support that Vlad and Courtney have provided to us has been pretty amazing. So particularly in the current climate, we wouldn't be doing any work if it wasn't for them providing us with a lot of support. I'd also like to acknowledge Chinova Resources and Mount Isa Mines, who've provided access for some detailed sampling campaigns. Thanks to Jim Austin and Jess and the team at CSIRO for providing access to some of their archive samples that we've been working on, and also our staff and the Codes Analytical Laboratories who help us generate the data that you'll be seeing today. So our contribution to the Strategic Resources Exploration Program is really a threefold focus, all related to mineral chemistry. So the first thing that we're trying to do is what we call deposit fingerprinting. And Dave Cook gave you an introduction to mineral chemistry that many of you will have seen a couple of weeks ago. So in this part of the project, we are trying to recognise the distinctive trace element signatures of hydrothermal alteration minerals that we find proximal to known ore deposits. And we're looking at minerals like pyrite and magnetite, chloride, epidote and calcite. And we're sort of trying to answer the question that Vlad raised of, are we in a mineral system? If we drill through, we hit some pyrite mineralization, it's not very exciting from an assay perspective. Can we help make an early decision about whether we are within a mineral system? The second component that we're working on are what we call deposit footprints. So this is looking to use mineral chemistry tools, which Dave talked about in the porphyry context a couple of weeks ago. We're trying to extend and test how well those tools work in the IOCG and the sediment-hosted context to give you an idea about how far away from a deposit you are. Finally, we are providing new dates and evaluating how well some non-traditional hydrothermal alteration minerals record geochronological information. And we're trying to test minerals like calcite, epidote, apatite, titanite, using laser ablation ICP-MS to give us information on the timing of particular minerals to, again, help with perhaps that early decision. Do you have the right timing of alteration compared to other known mineralized systems within an area? So I'm going to give you, basically I'm going to address something on part one, a little bit on part two, although we're still working pretty heavily on part two, and then I'm not going to address the dating today. So we've carried out fingerprinting work from multiple IOCG deposits. So working through a number of the deposits that you've heard about today, as well as we have some more detailed work ongoing at Ernest Henry, which Courtney's just presented you the whole rock geochemistry on. We haven't looked, to answer the question, we haven't looked at the barium content of feldspars. Feldspar has been on the sort of back end of our list. It's a challenging mineral because it's so common. It's almost a matter of where do you start. But we do have that on our list, and that's certainly something we can think about looking at from Ernest Henry's to address that barium content question. So we're working on Ernest Henry quite a bit with Vlad and Courtney, and then also on Swan. So we've done a bunch of sampling. Jonathan did a bunch of sampling last year with GSQ. And then Max Hole is a fairly recently started PhD student, is doing a detailed study at STARA. So at Swan, I'm just going to give you a little bit of an idea about some of the work we've done on particularly the magnetite at Swan, and a little snapshot at the end of what we're trying to work towards for a sort of mineral footprinting information. So the Swan deposit is hosted in the Staveley Formation. It's around about 15 million years old, based on molybdenite, rhenium, osmium dating. So just a little bit of background. Dave talked about a number of minerals a couple of weeks ago that we can use. So magnetite's an attractive mineral to target in IOCG systems because it has a variety of substitutions, including magnesium, iron, tin, a whole bunch of different minerals substitute quite readily into magnetite. I think I've chopped off half my slide there. So let's just quickly fast forward. It's particularly attractive because it hosts elements that could give us information about the oxidation state. So the idea is that we perhaps would fit additional vanadium or chromium or manganese into magnetite when we're in the more oxidized part of a system, or the magnetite is encountering a more oxidized fluid. Titanite can also record information about temperature, so it will have increasing amounts of titanium and aluminium when it's forming at higher temperatures. So clearly, when we're thinking about vectoring within IOCG systems where we might have gradients in temperature and particularly oxidation state, magnetite becomes quite an attractive mineral chemistry target. So we worked with a series of legacy CSIRO samples that had been worked on a previous study, as well as some newly collected samples last year from Swan, to both fingerprint the mineralization for both pyrite, magnetite, as well as several other alteration minerals, and also looking around mineralization at how does the chemistry of those minerals change as you move away from ore. So we did quite a lot of detailed work in and amongst some of the ore horizons. We can see plotted there are gold and copper assays shown in blue and orange respectively. And then the orange stars are where samples were collected from. So just to give you a little bit of an idea about what some of the different mineralization looks like. So these are some of CSIRO's TEMA maps. And so we've been working on the same samples to guide our mineral chemistry analyses. So we're not having to repeat all of that work. So we're just going to zoom in here on this little, see if I can get a laser pointer going. We're just going to zoom in down here on this little magnetite grain, which if we blow up the map, we can see we have a magnetite, which has also got some little inclusions present within it, revealed from the TEMA map. What we're going to look at are some laser ablation ICP-MS maps. So this is a technique where we raster the laser beam over the surface of the sample, and we collect major and trace elements and then correct the data to produce a map of concentration changes across the sample. So you can see here we have iron, so the iron's essentially delineating the magnetite grain, and you can also see these clear stripes across the sample, which represent where the magnetite has been altered. We can then look what is in those altered zones, and we see increased concentrations of elements like aluminium and manganese, and then we can look at commodity elements like copper or gold. So we get both information about paragenesis from this, as well as mineral chemistry zoning, which gives us information about how we should be approaching these samples from a spot sampling perspective. So one of the common features that we've seen in many of the IOCG samples that we've looked at is this overprinting, these cracks that come through, which are often associated with copper and gold. So we're now going to change to an amphibolite host rock. Again, we're going to zoom in on some of the hematite and magnetite, or so magnetite in this case, they're difficult to distinguish on the TEMA. So again, the iron is delineating the magnetite grain. We can see the fractures cutting through it with increased concentrations of aluminium, manganese. And in this example, we see much more clearly the enriched copper concentration sitting within those fractures. Again, if we look at a distinct example, this time a metasedimentary hosted magnetite, we're just going to zoom in on this little grain down here, intergrown with hornblende. And again, we see the same feature, the cracks and the elevated copper concentrations. So this information is allowing us to think about paragenesis. It allows us to try to screen our analyses, and it also provides us information on what we might expect to see when we're targeting magnetite within these horizons and interpreting our trace element data. So if we have a look, we can see that alteration of the magnetites is associated with magnesium, aluminium, silica, potassium, calcium, copper, rubidium, strontium, yttrium, tin, barium, cerium, gadolinium, lead, uranium, which I think says more about my scary knowledge of the periodic table. However, one thing that we're now trying to do is to now link this information back to the whole rock chemical data that GSQ's been collecting. So we're trying to go between scales here and allowing us to gain additional information on how we should be interpreting the whole rock geochemical data and some of the trends that come out of this. So we can operate at different scales and we can provide information about more robustly interpreting the whole rock geochemistry. So one thing that Jonathan's been working on are using multivariate statistics to help us try to predict how far we are from mineralization. So what you're going to see is a technique called discriminant projection analysis, which is essentially a method where we try to find the maximum separation between some samples that we've labeled. So in this case, Jonathan's labeled our samples as being either mineralized in red, proximal in green, or distal in blue, and then has tested which elements give us maximum discrimination between those two different populations. So you can see the list of elements there that we've used to help discriminate whether we are in the ore system, which is more of a fingerprinting approach, and then whether we are distal or whether we're starting to approach mineralization. So in this slide, what you're seeing are those discriminant projection colors taken, with blue being distal, red or orange being mineralized, and green being proximal. So we can see here that our discriminant projection approach is consistently fingerprinting many of our samples as being close to ore, although we're still certainly getting some samples indicating that they're distal. So this leads to then further questions about what's actually controlling the magnetite composition and what was controlling the fluid flow. Has that blue sample simply not seen the mineralizing fluid, or is our discriminant projection analysis flawed and needs to be further improved? So we're working quite hard on how we robustly interpret our footprint data and try to provide vectors towards mineralization. But there's certainly no doubt that magnetite associated with mineralization has these distinctive late cross-cutting fractures that include commodity elements. So I'm going to move on. Courtney, I think, has already basically given you an example of this type of diagram, some of the drill holes that we were jointly sampling. And what I'm going to provide you with is a summary of what we think is now quite a distinctive signature or fingerprint of IOCG mineralization-related pyrite, which we think has potential utility. So there's been a lot of work done on pyrite chemistry, both by codes and other groups around the world over the last 10 to 15 years or so. So what you're looking at here is a summary of magnetite chemistry from Ernest Henry. These have been, again, grouped into sort of proximal or mineralization holes, medial holes, and distal holes. And what we see at Ernest Henry, and indeed you'll see in the broader IOCG data set, is this transition from high cobalt, low nickel pyrite to low cobalt, high nickel pyrite. And what's particularly interesting about this, and why we think this is significant, is that similar trends have been seen by Chilean workers, Martin Reich and his co-workers, at some of the IOCG iron oxide apatite deposits in Chile, where they see the same sort of transition, and this blue box is showing you the extent of their diagram. In the Chilean systems, they see the same transition from high cobalt, low nickel pyrite to low cobalt, high nickel pyrite. So this seems to be something that's not just an Ernest Henry phenomena, or indeed a Northwest Queensland phenomena. This is something that seems to be common between several different regions around the world, which becomes significant, but we think because it means that it seems to be a relatively robust IOCG pyrite signature. So here's the field of the Reich pyrite, and now we're looking not just at Ernest Henry, but all of the Cloncurry data set from a whole range of different deposits that you can see in the colour scale over here. These are from the legacy CSIRO data sets. And again, we're seeing the same variation from high cobalt, low nickel pyrite to high nickel, low cobalt pyrite. So this seems to be a pretty robust signature that can be pulled out of IOCG mineralization related pyrite. If we go and look at these, and again, we produce laser ablation maps. So what you're looking at here are pyrite grains. So the pyrite's in orange, and you sort of have to rotate this a little bit. What you can see in here are that this is the pyrite grain, which is the same as this pyrite grain in here. And so what we see preserved within the pyrite grains is this zonation where the center of the pyrites are high cobalt and low nickel, and the outside of the pyrites are low cobalt and high nickel. So the trends that we can see in the spot data, we can now also see in the maps, which gives us a high degree of confidence when we come to interpreting that what we're seeing here is a genuine fingerprint of IOCG mineralization. We can go and look at a variety of different deposits, whether it's Ernest Henry, Brumby, Merlin, Cormorant, and we see the same transitions from high cobalt in the middle of the pyrites, variations in absolute concentration between systems, but we see the same spatial, which we interpret as a temporal change from high cobalt, low nickel to low cobalt, high nickel within these pyrites. So seen at multiple deposits, which suggests that this is potentially a pretty useful fingerprint for explorers to evaluate whether the pyrite that they've encountered in a drill hole is related to IOCG mineralization or not. And I haven't tested this, but my suspicion is that both the size of the pyrite grains and the cobalt nickel concentrations, particularly the cobalt, would easily be high enough to be detected by a method like handheld libs. So there's the potential that the information that we collect in the lab using pretty high-powered laser ablation ICP-MS instrumentation could actually be transferred out to the explorer using a readily available handheld instrument to look for these types of pyrite signatures when they're out exploring and collect the data in near real time. So finally, I'm going to come on to some work that Jonathan's been doing at Lady Annie. So Jonathan's been working on the carbonate veins, and particularly looking for, is there a distal footprint of the Lady Annie mineralization? And so the first part of this is evaluating what's the chemistry of the carbonate intergrowing with the copper mineralization close to the deposit, so we can then try to see if we can recognize that signature further from mineralization. So to do this, the carbonates have very complex paragenesis. They're too iron rich to do techniques like UV fluorescence, and even cathodoluminescence is often difficult. So what we've adopted is backscatter electron imaging. So we use our MLA and XMOD, which is basically a imaging and point counting mode, to extract information about the carbonates. We then take those maps and we stretch them in Photoshop, and so that we get more gain. And this leads to this interesting striping effect, which is related to our detector, because we've put such a high gain on the samples. What we can see are these beautifully oscillatory zoned carbonate veins, which are cross-cut by the bright white chalcopyrite. So we can now extract information from our point counting. We can use the imaging to try to recognize which generation of carbonate is intergrown with the chalcopyrite and is the fingerprint of mineralization. So what we see is that we have pre-mineralization carbonate, which is associated with this oscillatory zoned dolomite, which in the oscillatory zoning is mostly driven by changes in the iron content. So we change between a calcium magnesium to a more Ferroan dolomite, which is driving this oscillatory zoning. And then that early dolomite is cut by mineralization and another generation of carbonate. So let's have a bit of a zoom in here. So we can now begin to see this in the backscatter. And if Jonathan's, what he's done is he's taken this image where we can't see much detail at all in the carbonates in the black here, and he's put a stretch over this, and what we see are these cross-cutting, what Jonathan's termed a destructive generation of Ferroan dolomite that's cross-cutting the earlier dolomite and is intergrown with the chalcopyrite. And I think the CB are a few little, as I think that's just the carbonate that Jonathan's labelled in there. So you can see here this dark black sort of little veins of carbonate cutting through. this is the carbonate that we actually need to target if we want to look for the footprint of mineralization. So this is actually quite challenging because you've got to hit the right stuff. So we seem to have, Jonathan's recognised fairly early silicification, really compared to the pre-mineralization carbonate, and then overprinted. But what Jonathan's recognised is that the syn mineralization carbonate, and this is perhaps not surprising, we see similar signatures in many types of hydrothermal ore deposits. It's associated with elevated concentrations of manganese. So this seems to be the primary footprint and fingerprint signature that we're looking for, are these elevated manganese ferroan dolomites associated with the mineralization. And that's what we're now trying to chase more distally from the Lady Annie system as sampling allows us to. So we also have a few other signatures. The mineralization carbonates appear to be associated with elevated concentrations of zinc and potentially nickel and strontium, and possibly lower concentrations of vanadium and rare earth elements. However, we think the manganese is particularly significant because, again, it could likely be targeted potentially by something like a handheld LIBS instrument, or maybe a collimated portable XRF. So at Lady Annie, the mineralization is late and cross-cuts earlier formed dolomite veins, and those carbonates are enriched in manganese, zinc, nickel, and strontium, and the earlier silicious zoning is controlled by variations between calcium, magnesium, and iron ferroan dolomite. So in conclusions, we think that the fingerprinting work looks quite successful and relatively robust, where we can see this IOCG pyrite fingerprint. Whether it's useful to the explorer and whether we find that same signature in totally barren systems would be an obvious test to go and do. The carbonate fingerprints and footprints, it seems like the thing you were looking for is high manganese carbonate cements, most likely as discrete generations or fractures within earlier formed veins. And so that's something to go out and chase. Unfortunately, I don't think we can use something simple like a UV lamp to see these. The carbonates are too high in iron, so they're going to be difficult to see. However, I suspect I need to test that something like a handheld LIBS with its ability to raster map could be used as a field tool to try to look for high manganese carbonate cements within dolomite veins. So we're working on improving our footprinting information, working with magnetite, chloride, epidite, and calcite to develop, and we're finding that quite complex due to the scale and complexity of the alteration systems. So I'll stop there, and I'm not sure how I've gone for time, but I'm happy to answer some questions.
You're spot on for time, Shaun, so well done. And we do have some questions lined up, so hold on. Rob Rutherford is asking, have you considered looking at the trace element chemistry of the hematite inclusions within the red feldspar alteration?
That's a really nice idea, Rob. It probably depends how big they are. I suspect they're sub-micron, but that's certainly something that we could try to look at, is to try to target some of those hematite inclusions to see if they're little sponges for things like copper.
Cool. Okay, so Glenn Little is asking, how can this be applied when there is so much variability in deposit style across the district, e.g. near misses at Ernest Henry versus a near miss at Swan?
I think that's a great question, Glenn, and that's why we're doing the research to try to figure out where this is robust and works well, and where this falls apart, and that's why the research needs to be done. And this is still sitting in the research space, and we're trying to get it out to application, but there are certainly still lots of questions that need to be answered. So I agree with your, I think the question is a good one, and I agree with I guess it's a criticism or a question about how do we apply this, and I think it needs testing, obviously we can try to test it, but it needs testing by the minerals industry as well, to then see, where does this have wins and where does it fall apart, so we can try to begin to turn this into as robust an exploration tool as we can.
Glenn's commented in reference to his question just now, there are mineral systems that have just been presented that are well below sub-economic, but show the same characteristics as economic ones.
Yep, so I'm not sure, Glenn, that we'll be able to, whether we're going to get to the sort of fertility question, or whether we're going to get to the I think, you know, whether we're going to be able to tell you that you have a sub-economic versus an economic system from mineral chemistry, I think it'd be pushing the technique pretty hard. And so I'm not sure that we'll ever get to that point. I think it's an important question. But if we're telling you in the right type of system and you've drilled through cover, then maybe that's an advance on where we've been. But I agree with you. It's potentially tough sledding to tell you whether you're on an economic or a sub-economic system or what the grade's going to come up to based off the mineral chemistry. So there's I guess where some of the really cutting edge research questions are and need to be addressed to really try to push this.
Tim Krask says, excellent results, which is great feedback. Thank you. Tim also says, you can also use staining to discriminate carbonates, but this is old school.
Yeah, so we certainly could, Tim. Staining is often a bit of a mixed bag. Some of the dolomite stains in particular aren't very specific. And so the question would be, could we get the very iron-rich, would the iron-rich dolomite be recognisable or the manganese-rich dolomite be less recognisable within that overall footprint? So what I've mainly gone to is the SEM imaging to do that. They are certainly cathodoluminescence responsive under just optical CL, which is also sort of a bit of an old school method that I quite like. Certainly staining for them is something you could try to do. The other question that you might get is that they may have a different reactivity to something like HCl. They may be a little more reactive than normal dolomite. So I also wonder if you could just paint the veins with HCl and look for whether you see them distinctively fizzing. But we haven't gone to that sort of, I guess, field type approach to see if you can recognise these. But those are good ideas to try to help you recognise them out in the field.
Ian Garced asks, Shaun, do the later manganese-rich veins form a measurable halo around the mineralised copper body, or are they always mineralised?
That's the question we're trying to address now, Ian, is if we get out of the mineralisation and we get into distal veins, do they have this elevated manganese signature? The experience from, skarn or carbonate replacement type systems elsewhere would suggest that manganese in carbonate is likely to be one of the more distal indicators, but we haven't been able to prove that at somewhere like Lady Annie yet, so we're trying to do that at the moment. But based on experience elsewhere, other types of deposits, my prediction would be that yes, there should be a measurable halo, but it hasn't been proven at Lady Annie.
All right, Richard Scott says, happy to look at things that can be broadly systemised or tested in that sense. So that's great. Michael Thompson, curious if any comparable cobalt nickel patterns in regolith, AR digest, etc.
Yeah, good question. And one obvious thing that we need to go back and do is look at the cobalt nickel ratios in the whole rock data that GSQ has been collecting from Ernest Henry and elsewhere. So those are certainly good comments, and those linkages that we're trying to build now and scaling between data sets are what we're that's the next stage in the final year of the project.
All right, two more and then we'll move on. Marcus Tompkinson says, what actually are the garnets in the Ernest Henry ore zone? Are they calcic spessartines or something else?
Well, good, that's one not for me. Excellent.
Well, I think Courtney put up a slide earlier showing that they were spessartine. I'm not sure if she can answer that really quickly. If she's still there, she might have run away.
Okay, in case Courtney ran away, I can try because it has been identified in HiLogger. I don't think HiLogger library is that's well fine-tuned to tell you spessartine chemistry. It can see a spessartine from almandine. Don't ask more detailed questions from HiLogger.
Thanks, Vlad. Tobias says, how does the pyrite fingerprinting link to the observations that pyrite in many IOCG deposits actually predated the precipitation of copper sulfides?
I think that's a good question, Tobias. The fact that we're seeing it so systematically suggests that perhaps it's part of the overall system that enables you to form an IOCG, and that could then speak back to Glenn's question about why it isn't always a economic related pyrite. So this may be part of a mineral system. It's part of the system that produces it. it doesn't mean that it's you know, something producing a ton of mineralization necessarily, and perhaps that's why, is that the mineralization is then an overprint of that overall part of the system. So you know, it is a really good question, and I think there are you know, lots of that. So we might be fingerprinting the early part of the system, and then maybe not all the systems get the mineralization overprint. So I think there's still lots of work to be done, and there's lots of you know, IOCG experts like Richard has just chimed in there who could address those questions more readily than I can.